And with that, I'm going to turn it over and introduce Chris Polglase, who has over 35 years of experience in archaeological excavations, historical research, and applied cultural heritage studies. Chris may add to this introduction, but on a personal note, I want to say that I had the great pleasure of meeting Chris and working alongside him during my time, 5.5 years in France, working for the American Battle Monuments Commission. So Chris and I have walked around North Africa American Cemetery in Tunisia, which is entirely within the boundaries of Carthage World Heritage Site, spent time on the beaches of Normandy, etc. And he brings an outstanding perspective as the co-chair of the Cultural Heritage section of the International Association for Impact Assessment. And he's the co-author of a Smithsonian Institution publication on cultural heritage management in a UNESCO publication. So with that, Chris, thank you so much for being here. I think you're not even in the United States right now, if I remember correctly. So with that, I'll turn it over, and thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Christine. Actually, yes, I'm speaking to you from the coast of Normandy, actually here supporting the American Battle Monuments Commission. It was a true pleasure to work with Christine over the course of several years. We have some extraordinary sites here in Europe and around the world that often don't receive the recognition that they should in terms of how they're managed. So today I'm going to talk about management of cultural heritage sites, and specifically I'm going to talk about impact assessment. Impact assessment is how we manage change and how we manage projects that may have impacts on heritage sites. And the program that exists now within UNESCO's advisory bodies to address impact assessment has evolved dramatically over the last 10 to 12 years. I'm going to talk about that evolution to some degree. I think it's important to understand how that evolution has taken place. I'm an archaeologist. I think about change, and the change is important because we can use that to begin to understand where we are now and maybe where improvements might be needed in the future as well. So I'm going to first look at ICOMOS's 2011 guidance on heritage impact assessments. And you'll see that I've highlighted certain phrasing. These are quotes out of that HIA guidance. Heritage impact assessment is in fact its own little, if you will, cottage industry that did not exist until relatively recent, the last 20 years or so, whereas impact assessment goes back essentially to NEPA and to how environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment evolved internationally over the last 50 years or so. But let's go through just some of the information that's provided in the ICOMOS guidance from 2011. The emphasis in the guidance is on the management of outstanding universal value, OUV. And the guidance was specifically looking at addressing the methodology within HIAs to respond to potential change impacts within World Heritage sites. An important aspect of this is in the guidance as it was addressed or drafted at the time and how it's been used in the past is the lack of a legal structure or if you will, a programmatic methodology for how to do impact assessment on heritage sites. And that was it was thought to be a key issue when this was drafted. It is, in fact, was a key issue in regards to World Heritage Sites and OUV at the time. It still is one of the most significant hurdles in terms of looking at impact assessment when you're looking at World Heritage Sites. So continuing with the ICOMOS 2011 guidance, again, they emphasize how OUV underpins the whole World Heritage Convention and how OUV was defined within a statement of OUV is a concrete, explicit statement that was critical when the inscription took place. It's actually one of the most, if you will, significant hurdles for thinking about World Heritage Sites that were inscribed decades ago, because it's often difficult for OUV to be, if you will, a statement of OUV to keep up with the times. New information comes in. These OUV statements are thought to be immutable, if you will. And that can create challenges. And I'll come back to that later on. So operationalizing OUV is really what I consider one of the huge or most significant hurdles, because OUV is often, as it's drafted in a statement of OUV, a hard concept to articulate. It's hard to articulate. It's hard to figure out how it relates to specific attributes. This is when, for those of us that work within international impact assessment, breaking down a value such as OUV into measurable units so that you can understand what impacts might be. That's a critical part of our methodology. It is often not well understood by practitioners how to do it, especially with World Heritage Sites. And the new guidance begins to address this issue much more significantly. And one of the ways that is done is through the management plans that can be prepared for World Heritage properties. These management plans, and one of the aspects that we recommend is to make sure that management plans make a significant effort to operationalize the concept of OUV, how to measure it within attributes, how to measure change in attributes, and to do this proactively so that when a project comes along, there is a set toolkit, if you will, for that particular World Heritage Site that speaks to how OUV will be measured, changes will be measured, impacts will be measured, and to have that in place so that there's a consistent approach from one project to another. So in sort of summarizing the guidance from 2011, it sees HIAs often as standalone assessments that focus on cultural attributes. They really don't speak about natural attributes or natural heritage sites in any great degree. The guidance is not prescriptive. It focuses, as mentioned, on OUV. The participation of stakeholders is mentioned, but not emphasized. And other attributes that don't convey OUV are placed on a much lower level of consideration than those that convey OUV. This is understandable, but when it comes down to the issue of how to operationalize across those that convey OUV and those that don't, it becomes more problematic. And there was no mention of strategic environmental assessment or other tools that exist in the impact assessment space. When it comes to the IUCN guidance from 2013, it's interesting that 2 years later, IUCN really jumped forward with some clear position statements on what they considered to be important for when considering World Heritage and impact assessment, the impact. And for example, it calls out oil and gas and mining projects as not compatible with World Heritage status. Those are clearly articulated in 2013, and those stood up as the thinking of IUCN until very recently. That's continuing on, looking at the information from the 2013 guidance. The guidance from IUCN really focuses on natural World Heritage sites and thinks about how to integrate the assessment of impacts on World Heritage sites within environmental assessments or environmental and social impact assessments. So the approach used by IUCN is much more on utilizing the techniques and the considerations of international practice as it existed at the time. For example, there's a focus on assessing alternatives, measuring alternatives, thinking about those alternatives, and also to think about a no project option. The no project option is not something that exists across most of the impact assessment practice, but it certainly makes sense within what IUCN was putting forth in 2013, that there's some projects that just are not supportable within a World Heritage site. The guidance at that time from IUCN talks about the different kinds of impact assessment and talks about the value of strategic environmental assessments, for example. It emphasizes looking at the World Heritage site within a larger setting. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. It really goes into details on how the advisory body review process works, who calls who presents information where feedback is provided. Interestingly, heritage that doesn't convey OUV is barely mentioned in 2013. So here are the principles that they emphasize. I won't go into these in great detail, other than, for example, to reflect international practice of getting involved in assessing impact on a World Heritage site early on, considering direct, indirect, and cumulative effects, and working within a mitigation hierarchy. One strong suggestion, and this is actually very important, is to make sure that a separate chapter on World Heritage be included in environmental assessment. Because World Heritage is its own type of thing. It's not just an environmental resource. It's not just a cultural resource. And the methodology used is different. It's important to make sure that it is included in itself on its own, but at the same time that it's built into a larger framework of assessments for a larger project. Public disclosure of the impact assessment is also called out and is critical. Many times, those of us that work in the World Heritage space for cultural sites have found cases where an HIA is prepared by a state party and it actually never sees the light of day because it doesn't reflect what the state party necessarily wants to hear. So public disclosure is really important. Independent auditing of post or of construction phase activities, post IA activities is also called out. So just a few summary notes on where IUCN was in 2013. There was a greater emphasis on stakeholder engagement and transparency from IUCN, but Indigenous peoples were still not called out as having unique rights. The need for integration of World Heritage consideration into the larger EA process was also seen as important. And this is from those of us within the larger impact assessment community, we see this as critical. So summarizing where we were in 2018, the guidance on natural World Heritage and cultural World Heritage was relatively silent. Different guidance, using, in many cases, different methods of assessment. There was almost no discussion of mixed World Heritage sites. The guidance from ICOMOS was out of step with international practice on stakeholder engagement, especially related to Indigenous peoples. At that time, FPIC and free, prior, and informed consent, and was not mentioned at all. This was certainly out of step with where international practice was going. So now we can pivot to talking about the new guidance. It's been greatly expanded. The new guidance, which just came out this past summer, essentially work on it began in 2018, coordinated under the World Heritage Leadership Program by ICOMOS. There were some initial meetings in 2018 in Gland, Switzerland at IUCN's offices. IAIA, two of us were invited to participate in those 2 days of meetings to talk about what best practice in impact assessment looked like, and how we thought the new guidance could begin to address the needs of alignment with international practice. We worked with ICOMOS, the World Heritage Leadership Program, to coordinate sessions at our international conference in Brisbane in 2019, including a workshop that brought together practitioners from around the world to talk about what enhanced impact assessment for World Heritage might look like. We missed out in 2020. We were going to be in Seville to continue those conversations. Many of us missed out on a lot in 2020, but over the intervening 2 to 3 years, there were a lot of conversations. There was a lot of back and forth. There were a lot of rewrites to end up with the document that's now available. So at the front of the guidance, I think that there are 11 principles that are outlined, and I think that some of them really need to be emphasized. First and foremost, signing the convention conveys responsibilities on the state party for protection and conservation. This is emphasized in part because many state parties look to the value, the economic value of having a site listed on the World Heritage list, but don't necessarily put in place the infrastructure to protect and conserve those sites. The obligation to notify the World Heritage Center on potential impacts is crucial in terms of these responsibilities. In many cases, the World Heritage Center is not aware of a project that has the potential to impact OUV. Sometimes this is done willfully, sometimes it's done out of ignorance, but that obligation to notify is critical. The emphasis on beginning an impact assessment early is also absolutely critical. There have been many cases where HIAs have been prepared for projects that have very considerable impact on the World Heritage Sites OUV. And those HIAs are started after the state party has already approved the project. The project may be well advanced. And the World Heritage Center is finding out about it and commissioning an HIA to be prepared. By that time, it's just too late. The key decisions have been made. Many of the impacts are already baked into the project as it's proposed. So emphasizing early and often discussions is crucial. There's absolute emphasis now on stakeholder engagements, call out for rights holders, including Indigenous peoples, is beginning to align with where international practice is for impact assessment. These are the language that's provided in the new guidance is really quite helpful. As with the IUCN guidance from 2013, there's a look towards considering reasonable alternatives, sustainable outcomes, an emphasis on looking at broader trends and cumulative impacts on a resource. And there's an emphasis on embedding a management system or putting in place the infrastructure for managing a World Heritage property for an extended period of time. So the guidance provides options for how you go about including a World Heritage consideration into an EA or an ESIA or as a standalone HIA. There's really increased emphasis on setting and impacts that could be both direct and indirect from outside the site boundaries or even outside a buffer zone. As I mentioned, early participation is crucial. There are graphics that really emphasize this issue. For those who are not used to working within the international impact assessment space or doing an EIS here in the US, the value of coordinating early is really called out. And this is, again, crucial. Talked about rights holders and stakeholders being involved early as well. The guidance does a nice job of talking about strategic environmental assessment and how it can help and how it can look at impacts, programmatic impacts on a landscape scale. This is the type of consideration that many federal agencies are starting to think about. They started to think about it about a decade ago. Then there was a little bit of a hiccup, but thinking about sites, impacts, and assessment of value on a landscape scale, doing it programmatically, that's what SEA is about. The guidance provides these flow charts, again, that are helpful for non-practitioners. And the guidance finally starts to talk about other heritage values and how to begin to think about those. The use of a mitigation hierarchy is important. This begins to align with the broader international practice. Environmental and social management plans and auditing. These are, again, part of how project impacts are tracked internationally. Having these outlined as an alternative for consideration, again, it begins to help non-practitioners understand that an impact assessment is not a one and done thing. It's actually a matter of getting the framework in place, beginning to assess the impacts, tracking the impacts, thinking about where you may not have not assessed impacts correctly, incorporates concepts such as change management. So it's really a much more up-to-date approach. And the guidance includes a toolkit at the back end of it that is useful for those who haven't necessarily prepared many impact assessments. So essentially what we're looking at is a maturation of the impact assessment practice by the World Heritage Committee's advisory bodies. It's a clear enhancement and a move towards international practice. There's a greater emphasis into how to align and move between an EIA, ESIA, or to do a standalone HIA. And the emphasis on stakeholder and rights holder engagement is really crucial. Speaking to having a management plan in place for a World Heritage Site was really called for. As I mentioned earlier on, operationalizing the concept of OUV is tough. It's really tough to do on the fly. Whether you're doing an EIS or an EA or any other kind of impact assessment, having essentially a cookbook outlined in the management plan of how to think about a World Heritage Site's OUV, how to begin to assess individual impacts, is really incredibly helpful. Not lacking that kind of guidance at the beginning of a project leaves the impact assessment professional wondering how to do it. So I'll leave on that note that this is one of the recommendations that IA has made in the past, is to not only think about how to move ahead with a practice for World Heritage Sites that is aligned with international practice, but also to think about management plans that are that consider issues such as operationalizing OUV. And so I will close out at that point and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Chris. That was absolutely fantastic. And I would encourage, I think there are some questions that some of the other panelists especially would like to bring forward. So with that, we've got about 14 minutes for question and answer. And so for any panelists or participants in the webinar, please go ahead. And if you're remote, put your question in the chat. If you're a panelist, feel free to chime in and ask Chris directly. Thanks, Chris.
Chris, this was terrific. Really great. I have several questions as to how the HIA requirement could translate to the U.S. National Park Service's World Heritage Sites. The Park Service has a statutory requirement that every park have a general management plan. The guidance that exists does not specifically say for those World Heritage parks, that they have to cover OUVs, but it could, and that could be a useful thing. You may have a thought or two to add on that. And I would also say that most impacts to U.S. World Heritage sites that are national parks occur outside the boundary, because the parks standards, the law, the Organic Act, etc., are pretty strict to begin with. But they often occur outside the boundary. Many of them occur because of actions of other federal agencies. And there's no requirement that there is a NEPA requirement, of course, but there's no requirement that they take World Heritage sites into account. There's no requirement that they do HIAs, but being signatory to the treaty ought to make, in my mind anyway, not being a lawyer, ought to make the U.S. responsible for requiring those other agencies, when they take actions, to assess impacts on OUVs in those World Heritage sites, even though those agencies don't manage World Heritage sites. What do you think?
Well, I'll start with the first part of your question. It's an absolute critical challenge when you're operationalizing an impact assessment and you have a World Heritage site, that you first of all figure out what attributes actually speak to OUV. What are they? How can you support them and break down those attributes that support OUV? Then you have, at any World Heritage site, many attributes, many resources that you can't really say address OUV, and yet the World Heritage Site Manager has responsibility for managing them. And so my thinking is that your World Heritage, your management plan has to talk about this. How do you put them all into a blender and come up with an answer on and how to think about this? This is where my experience, most management plans fail, because they haven't worked through all the different scenarios. They haven't worked through, if you have 18 of these widgets that don't convey OUV, but are still resources that you have to manage under NHPA, how do you do that when you're also looking at maybe impacts on two attributes that do convey OUV? Those of us that do a lot of international impact assessment have like different charts and graphs on how we think about this kind of stuff. If you can have this proactively for a particular site, then you're less likely to have an idiosyncratic approach of somebody coming along and saying, this is not an, this is how I'm doing it. And, I don't care how other people would do it. When it comes to impacts from off-site, this is why you have to have this kind of information up front, if at all possible, in a management plan, because you have to be able to convey to an external federal agency, yes, you are doing this. Yes, you are having this impact on us. And yes, here's the result of your impact. We have to flow this up through the following process. You can't do your dam project upriver from us and blithely ignore the fact that it's going to have a knock-on effect on us, because it puts us in a particular issue, particular position where we have to do X, Y, and Z. The more that can be conveyed early, and often I would think that kind of conversation almost has to be potentially FPO to FPO. If it just, we've lacked the emphasis on this particular topic. And I think that, this forum really is valuable to begin to think about how to emphasize what's critical.
Chris, that was fantastic. We do have thank you so much. And thanks, Destry, for the question. I know we've got a question in the chat, but first I see that Doug Homer has his hand up for a question, and then we'll go to the chat.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Good to see you.
Hey, Doug. Good to see you.
So I've been waiting for these new guidelines to come out. I've been involved with HIAs. And the 2011 guidelines leave, as you've pointed out, a lot to be desired. They're very difficult and not clearly presented, and there's some issues in actually applying them. When did the new ones, when were they actually released? It must have been just recently.
I think July or August. They snuck them out. Those of us that worked on them for a while were waiting to see them, Doug. In fact, when you and I met back in the spring, they hadn't been released. So the version that I've been speaking to came out, and they did an extraordinary job over the last 6 to 9 months in addressing comments that came from practitioners around the world.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated issue, there's no doubt. And I note here in the chat that John Fowler is going to be talking about HIAs that were prepared for 3 World Heritage Sites in the United States. But I'm sorry about this. Should have turned that off. My question is this, and I haven't had a chance to look at the new guidelines, obviously, but you mentioned something. Is there going to be something in the guidelines that would sort of integrate these HIA examinations with other EIS or EA type documents? Or is that a suggestion that you're making?
So they talk about the potential, Doug, for standalone HIAs. Mm-hmm. But I think the strong recommendation is, so if, a standalone HIA being, if you think that the impacts are primarily cultural and it's being done outside of some broader project. But if the clear recommendation in the new guidance is, if you're doing you're assessing impacts on a World Heritage Site in the context of a much larger project, you should be doing it in a much more integrated fashion.
Yep.
So the only, and I know, Doug, for example, that you're involved in doing like reactive HIA for a project that's already been approved.
Exactly.
Then under those circumstances, your hands are tied. And you're going to have to follow that process that, essentially is outlined for an HIA. But even what they outline for an HIA is much more comprehensive in terms of approach than what existed back in 2011.
Yeah. Well, that's why that's one of the reasons the 2011 guidelines are really wanting. But, in the case of a project that's already gone ahead, the only leverage is the mitigation recommendations. And that should have some teeth, basically. That's really the only lever that we have at this moment, with a project that's already underway. And then I think it's going to be a real issue, as you mentioned, to get World Heritage Sites in various places in the world to initiate these HIAs, because a lot of times the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. I mean, we see this everywhere in the world, but a project will just forge ahead and not everybody in the country is actually aware that it's happening. So that's going to be another hurdle to cross. But I congratulate you on your work on these new guidelines, because they are desperately needed. And it sounds as though they're going to be a great improvement. So thank you so much for your work on this.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Yes, Chris, thank you so much. I mean, I think for many people, at least for U.S. World Heritage Site practitioners, you are introducing this concept to some sites who might not be familiar at all with HIAs. So the very last question, we have 2 minutes left of this fantastic session. The question in the chat is an outstanding one, I think. How do we operationalize outstanding universal value? And could you, in the 1 minute we have left, give an example or two?
Wow. That's all I can say is it's super particularistic. And operationalizing OUV, you have to try and figure out what the component elements are that contribute to the value, what the attributes are. But those attributes can be tangible or intangible. We live in a time when the input of stakeholders, indigenous peoples, is absolutely critical. These are concepts that were barely in play 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So when you start thinking about operationalizing OUV, first thing to do, in my mind, is break down that OUV statement as best you can, figure out what attributes might apply to it, then look at those attributes and try and figure out what are the elements that are actually related to the attributes, and begin, almost like a giant storyboard it, if you will. Storyboard it and figure out how these pieces all come together. It's not easy. That's why I recommend people try to think about it early as they develop a management plan, as opposed to when they're looking at an individual project. By then, this operationalization process is awfully complicated.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris, so much. Please tell my colleagues and friends in Normandy that I said hello. Give everybody my best at Normandy American Cemetery in Pointe-du-Hoc. And thanks for a great session. And with that, we're going to pivot to Elizabeth Lee from Cyark. Elizabeth serves as the Vice President for Programs and Developments for Cyark. Her expertise includes developing international partnerships and supportive technology-driven solutions for cultural heritage protection, education, and appreciation. There are many more amazing things about Liz. She's trained as an archaeologist, but she's been applying 3D technologies to the cultural field for nearly 20 years, to include U.S. World Heritage Sites. So I will defer to Liz in case she wants to add any more to her bio, but I don't want to cut into her presentation time. So at the end of Liz's presentation, I will do a wrap up as this is the final day. And this is our final session for the inaugural U.S. World Heritage Site Managers Forum. So with that, welcome, Liz.
Thank you so much, Christine. I appreciate it. And really nice to be a part of this. I was able to listen in on some of the sessions earlier and some great discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just walk through. Some of you may be familiar with our organization. Some this may be the first time hearing of us. So I did just want to give a little bit of introduction to who we are, and then wanted to show a couple of examples of some of the work that we've done. One international World Heritage Site, and then one here in the US. So just quickly, we are a nonprofit organization, really with this mission of empowering connections to historic places. We have been doing this for, as Christine said, almost 20 years. We were founded in 2003, and we were formerly headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area. But since about March of 2020, we went remote and then made it a permanent fix. So now we actually have people all over the country and a few people internationally as well. But we were really one of the early pioneers in this application of 3D data or 3D recording technologies for documenting cultural heritage. As the technology has evolved, our mission has expanded too. And so, a lot of the early days work in applying 3D technology to cultural heritage documentation, it was pretty limited what you can do with it. And now I think the possibilities are endless. And so we've put a lot of effort towards using this information to connect new audiences to cultural heritage sites to really inspire that reflection, conversation, and imagination. I think this group is probably well versed in the why. We do what we do, but we really do believe that historic places play a critical role in building and defining community identity, yet they often remain unknown or out of reach for many. And so our objective is by creating more equitable and respectful access to these places through digital technologies that we can help actually lift up new voices and increase our shared understanding. So we've done this work on over 200 sites in more than 40 countries. In terms of what we do, we think about, we kind of talk about our work in 3 different areas. And so I wanted to highlight a bit in each of these areas. So one is in the storytelling space, which heard a lot of discussion earlier about, how do you get people to care about these sites? It's really about the story of these places. And we feel quite strongly about that as well. But we also work with professionals on the ground to empower doing that documentation of the sites and also providing training to support local professionals. And then open access has been a huge part of our mission. This is something that we've done a lot in over the last few years as new tools have been developed, and it's gotten easier to share this type of data. So I'll talk about that as well. In terms of how we measure ourselves, we think about our work in regards to impact, and we look at that in really kind of 3 different areas. So one is about creating equitable access to cultural heritage. We think about that in terms of these experiences that we've created. And again, all of our work is sort of digital, virtual work. So we're not thinking about that on-site experience as much, but really about how you bring in new audiences. And I'll talk about some of the ways that we do that. We also have shifted a lot towards building capacity within the cultural heritage sector. So running a huge amount of workshops these days, both virtual and in person, to help build those skill sets. And then, how do we make this data open and reusable? I think is a key part that a lot of times these sites are recorded. How do you actually make sure that the people who need that information have access to it, as well as others within the broader community that might want to use that for further research and making sure that that's done in a way that allows for maximum reuse, but also respecting any of the sensitivities around any of those sites. So we do this work through a number of partners. We've worked with the National Park Service, I think going back as far as 2006 or 2007. Also work, in the US with local park systems and other federal agencies. The BLM we've done a lot with, and then internationally we also do a lot with the Department of State and like the US Ambassadors Fund. And then we work with corporate philanthropic partners and other foundations to help support the work as well. So that's a little bit about who we are. I wanted to talk about some of the tools and things for doing this work. So a lot of people know us because of this 3D documentation work, and that still is a core tenet of what we do. So I wanted to start there. Even though this example is from internationally, but our methodology for recording these sites fuses data from LiDAR as well as aerial and terrestrial photogrammetry to create a really high resolution mesh of the site. So just to show how we do that, I've got a quick video here. Which I can just talk over. So this is an example from the Metropolitan Cathedral, part of the inscription in Mexico City, very large structure. So LiDAR, or the light detection and ranging, or 3D laser scanning as it's known sometimes, is kind of the start of our process. We move that scanner around the site and create this point cloud model. And then we supplement that with photogrammetry. So this is a series of high resolution images that are taken at set points around the site with overlap to be able to merge them together. And then that is further supplemented with aerial photogrammetry, so using drones or UAVs. And you can see here all those different photographs that are taken of the exterior of the building. All of that gets fused together to form a very high resolution model of the site, which you can do things like renderings. You can cut through the building. We use this underlying model as kind of the backbone of some of our storytelling, but we can also create outputs that help facilitate the conservation and monitoring of these sites as well. So I did want to talk briefly, just one case study of how some of this work is being used, or how this data can help support kind of ongoing management at World Heritage Sites. So we've been working at the Osun Osogbo Sacred Grove in Nigeria, I think since 2017 or 2018. And this is a site that is both a natural and a cultural site because of these amazing structures and sculptures that have been created there in the grove. One of the big challenges of this site, though, is its location along the river there, which is a sacred river. It's very important. They've seen increased flooding, and in particular, this is the Busayan Shrine, has been inundated the last several years with the floodwaters from that adjoining river. So we started a project there. We had been at the site before, consulting with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, NCMM, as well as the foundation that works at the site, about what could be done. And so in this case, we went out and did 3D documentation, also did a small training with members of NCM as part of it to develop a high resolution 3D model. The purpose in this case was to take this underlying 3D data as well as additional kind of survey points that were collected to then develop a plan, kind of a mitigation strategy for how to help preserve this site with the flooding. And so we worked with engineering firm, gave them all of this 3D data, and then they did a whole hydrological analysis and came up with suggestions on how the site could be modified to better withstand the flooding. And so one of the interesting things is about this project is, the underlying data is helping inform this analysis. But it was also used, the whole project was used as a way to generate conversation with the community there. So they, in addition to, studying the data that they had, that they went out and did interviews with community members, trying to understand what sort of solutions would actually be appropriate for that space. Moving the site entirely is not an option because of how important that position is. But they've ultimately decided to build some of these, elevate the site slightly and build a series of kind of retaining walls to help with the water incursion. And so this was funded through a U.S. Ambassadors Fund for cultural preservation, and they are now going to be applying for a grant to actually implement the strategy that's been developed using this 3D data to help inform what's happening on site. And so as part of what we do both in-person and virtual workshops where we train people in a variety of the pieces that we use as part of our process. So in some cases, we're just training on the photography and photogrammetry. Sometimes it's the entire end-to-end process. But this has become a huge part of, we've done some of this work as part of the work in Nigeria, but continue to do this piece kind of all around the world, especially with the onset of these virtual workshops that really became quite popular the last few years with the pandemic. A major focus for us and is around specifically storytelling now. As I mentioned, historically we've been very involved in doing that 3D documentation to help in that conservation and management, and there are a lot of great applications. But one of the things that I think has become quite clear for us is that this need to be able to highlight the stories of these places as a way to get people to care and take action. So similarly, the storytelling process really leverages this high resolution, the photorealistic models. And some of the ways that we do that are through both immersive experiences. We've done a number of experiences that leverage things like virtual reality, but then we also have a focus around web and mobile based experiences. So some of our immersive examples, we did a big program on bringing Bagan in Myanmar, a recent World Heritage Site, a full interactive experience, which was developed in partnership with Google Arts and Culture. And then Mesa Verde, which I also want to talk about in terms of the next case study, a US site here, a World Heritage Site, has been involved in a few of our initiatives around bringing that into virtual reality. So the first was a VR application, Masterworks, which featured several cultural heritage sites, 2 in the US with Mount Rushmore and Mesa Verde, and then the site of Ayutthaya and in Thailand, and Shifin de Wantar in Peru. And then building on some of that experience, we've also been working on a National Endowment for Humanities grant, looking at the use of 3D and virtual reality to highlight new narratives about these sites. And so I wanted to show a couple of these examples rather than just talking through it related to Mesa Verde. So in the Masterworks application, which is what you'll see here, you have this full 3D immersive model, which was created using that photogrammetry and LiDAR at Balcony House in Mesa Verde. And so the user can explore the site, can look around as if you're there. And then we worked with National Park Service rangers to provide interviews and clips about telling more about the site itself. And I don't know if we show any of these clips, but you really can kind of get a sense of the place when you're in the experience. But yeah, you can hear from a resource manager talking about the different aspects of the site. This takes you out to learning about the kind of system of check dams and the agricultural systems. And this was a really interesting project to be able to take some of those authentic voices as well, and tell people about, share different aspects of the site. That work really inspired us, though, to go further. And one of the things that we wanted to do was highlight some of the other stories, particularly partnering with descendant communities. So we worked on this prototype project under the National Endowment for the Humanities to take that same data set of Balcony House, and working very closely with a few different descendant communities. The Hopi Preservation Office was our primary partner on this one, but worked to bring their voices. So this experience is actually voiced by members of the descendant communities. There's Hopi in there. There's also Tewa language within the experience. And so using that same data set, able to bring in different graphics. The player in the experience activates what are called these resonances, and they are taken to these kind of vignettes of different pieces of the site's history. And so this is something we have applied for kind of a full grant to bring this out from a prototype into a published experience, and hope to kind of continue to work with descendant communities to bring their voices into the experience, which has been really powerful. But as great as VR is, we really wanted to do more to provide access to diverse audiences when it comes to connecting to these places. And really the best way to do that is through an online, like a web or a mobile experience. So earlier this year, we announced our Tapestry platform, which is our platform for building and telling these place-based stories that's focused on web and mobile devices. I'll play just this short introduction, and then I'll show some stuff from Mesa Verde.
The world is full of wondrous places, and every place has a story. Tapestry is a platform for building and telling stories, allowing you to reach and engage new audiences. A high-resolution, photorealistic model provides the perfect canvas for storytelling and open exploration. Construct your journey with stops at key points within the model, and add audio or video commentary from expert guides. Provide visitors with access to locations outside the model with high-resolution and immersive panoramic imagery. Supplement the commentary with additional media items, such as historic photographs and video, to provide greater context. Bring the scene to life with handcrafted vignettes that augment the model and illustrate your story. Deliver your experience on mobile and web devices and seamlessly integrate the story into your own website or application. Tapestry. Tell your story.
So using this platform, and I think we worked with Mesa Verde before we had to kind of announce the platform to develop a tour of Balcony House, again using that same data set, but narrated in this time by a National Park Service ranger. So Drew Reagan worked very closely with our team to develop what the plan would be along the tour.
While cliff dwellings are the most well-known types of homes found on Mesa Verde, they're not the only type. For hundreds of years, the ancestral Pueblo people lived primarily on the mesa top. Their stone-built villages surrounded by fields of corn, being.
So I'll go ahead and talk over him for a second here, but taking this data set into this platform, this is live on our website right now. Anyone can take this tour. And what Drew does is he takes you to different places within the site, kind of similar to what you might get if you were on an in-person tour of ICOMOS. And part of the reason that the Balcony House was initially a focus for this type of work is just related to access. This is a site you have to climb a 30-foot ladder in order to access. You've got to crawl through some tight places. I think it's considered one of the more adventurous tours because of that, and I think people really like it. But it also means that only a limited number of visitors can come into the site and can learn these stories. And so the park was quite excited, I think, about being able to make this more available and accessible to supplement the audience that is reached by those in-person ranger tours. So within the platform, there's a number, or within the tour, there's a bunch of stops. And, in this case, some of the partners that we work with, when they've got such developed interpretive plans, it's quite easy for them to just create a tour, and we work with them to integrate it into the 3D model. And so this is something that they are linking to on their site, and the reception has been really great on our end. We're seeing a huge amount of use of these tours in a classroom setting. So thinking about things like the virtual field trip, how do you again bring in new audiences for your site that maybe can't travel out there? I think Mesa Verde Foundation earlier was mentioning that people do not come to Mesa Verde without the intention of coming there. It's not just a swing by kind of site, which also means it's quite difficult for a lot of people to access. So ways like this are ways that you can bring in new audiences into the experience. I'll just come back to the presentation. So yeah, and some of the features of the Tapestry itself is you have that real 3D. You can look around in the same way as a panorama, but you can also just move, as I was showing through kind of the arrow navigation on your keyboard. We have that expert narration. We've also started to bring in a lot of supplemental media, and one of the other things that we've done on more recent tours is have kind of a primary guide, like we have here, the ranger, but also bringing in other voices. And so this would be an opportunity to bring in many different perspectives about this site, as opposed to just the kind of formal inter perspective. And then, just because I wanted to leave some time for questions at the end, I'm going to go ahead and race to just the last subject, which is just about open access. And I think this maybe has come up in some earlier sessions as well. One of the core components for our mission on founding was, how do we make this stuff available? How do we make sure that this data is available for future generations? And the tools to do that have gotten a lot easier over the years. But I want to say about 4 years ago, it just became so cumbersome for us, where we are having to field individual requests, that we came together with a few other partners, university partner and another agency, international cultural agency, to develop this Open Heritage 3D platform. And what this is it's really a repository for 3D data sets of cultural heritage sites. So I wanted to show it. There's nearly 300 sites here today. And what this is any of the people that are collecting the data, or site authorities, can contribute data sets to this. And so that Balcony House data is here. You get a preview of the data that's available, and you can actually download that spatial data. You have to agree to the terms to use it, since through Creative Commons licenses have been applied to these for non-commercial use and attribution. But that means that researchers wanting to engage with this material, the site themselves, sometimes if the management change at the site. Sometimes they don't know what happened to the data that was captured several years ago. And so from this, we're able to just send them a link and they could download it directly. And, you know, again, making sure that we're working with the site and the communities to only make data available that can be kind of in that public domain space, and control access around how it's used. We have sites that we have assured that because of cultural reasons are not on open heritage. We would like them to be, or maybe portions of them are. But we see a real utility in making this content available, so that, you know, it's there as a resource, and that work that's gone into recording the site and understanding it doesn't have to be redone every few years. So we've got a number of kind of contributing partners on this platform now. A lot of universities contributing to this, and the hope is to kind of continue to grow this repository over time. And yeah, there's just a really wide variety of sites within there. So I think with that, I wanted to close the formal part of just sharing all of this and open it up to discussion and questions.
Wow, Liz, thank you so much. And I will say that I have worked with Cyark on multiple continents in multiple countries at this point, on a number of sites, both U.S. World Heritage sites to include Taos Pueblo and other sites, but also overseas in some other countries. So with that, I really appreciate this. A fantastic presentation. And as you mentioned, open access has come up a few times already during the forum. I think in a very practical for U.S. World Heritage Site Managers kind of framework for as a strategy for addressing some of the equity and inclusion and access, you know, that you highlighted as well. But with that, I would really like the opportunity to for other panelists or for folks to put questions or Q&A in the chat for Liz. It usually takes people a minute or two to unmute and mic up. So I will ask you a question. Sure. Can you talk about the connection to, you know, to open access and the relationship perhaps between Cyark and Google Arts and Culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, you saw them on one of my intro slides. You know, they're an organization that we've worked with for a long time, and you know, the way that we view them is, you know, there's a couple aspects to our relationship. You know, one is that they have a platform. They have their Google Arts and Culture platform, which, you know, can be used by museums and sites to make content available. And so we use that as part of, like, within our website, we've embedded what they call like exhibits or stories. That's basically a slideshow, right? And it's a great tool for us to just be able to have kind of a very simple, you know, take somebody through a simple narrative with great visuals. The great thing about their platform is that the whoever is uploading the content actually retains control over it. So you know, by putting content up there, you're not giving it to Google necessarily. I mean, they are surfacing that content, they are hosting it and serving it, but all of the kind of contributor agreements actually enable whatever organization is publishing through them to pull stuff down if they don't want it up there. And that's been, you know, so we see it as a great tool to, you know, reaching new audiences for us is a huge part of the work that we do. And in addition to the tool, they've been really a great partner organization for us. So they have also provided financial support for some of these projects. You know, I've known kind of the head of their cultural heritage group, Chance, for a number of years, and I think they really are committed. There's a good mission alignment, I think, between their organization and ours, in terms of, you know, getting people interested in these places, but also really approaching it with a lot of respect for the sites themselves and making sure that their voices are included and their perspectives are included. So would be happy to talk more about it, but that's, they're both a tool for us and then also a great partner.
Thanks. That was a great explanation. So I see there are a couple of different questions. So in the question and answer section, is there a clearinghouse, Liz, or central source of information on the use of virtual reality for World Heritage Site visitation? And then there's another question I'll follow up.
Yeah, I don't know of any like clearinghouse. I think the VR and like the metaverse is still early, right? I think that we've been doing VR projects going back to, I think, 2016, 2017, we started experimenting. Our kind of push with Tapestry and the online is in part because of the just how young it feels and kind of how the challenges there, I think. That being said, it is a really powerful thing to step into one of these sites in VR. It's amazing, right? I think for people that can have that experience, it gives you that sense of place. You have that immersion that you're never going to get with just like a screen in front of you. So I know a lot of people have done work there. There's kind of constant work happening within that because a lot of these places are just visually so powerful, and they're the kind of sites that people want to go and explore when they can't travel. So but I don't know of a single like clearinghouse for this, or I don't remember the rest of the question, if that helps answer it.
That was great. So we have kind of a follow-on question and then another question. So so in the chat, what, if any, vision does Cyark foresee that the data can be used in future technologies like the metaverse? So I think you kind of touched on it, but do you want to add anything before we pivot to the last question? Yeah,
I think, so our objective, I think, is, from the data capture side, is that we capture these data sets so that they do have a long timeline, right? In that, we're capturing the sites at a higher resolution than we can show today through the web and even through VR devices. So I think we put real efforts there to try to make sure that there's some longevity to this. And then I think the other piece is, again, consultation with these sites, right? How can we, if the sites are going to be in VR, right? If there's an interest, talking to the sites themselves about how they want to present those stories, and what sort of voices should be present in those experiences. I think there is huge potential for this, kind of, again, virtual visitors, growing your audience, getting people excited about these places. And yeah, I think we're really interested in the potential of it, and see potential there, even if it's not there like today.
Great, that was a fantastic response. This question has come up, Liz, a few different times. And so can you go into some detail? I know we've got 9 minutes left. So, but about who owns the data from the projects?
Yeah, so we, I would say in the history of our organization, we've had a number of different models because it can be quite confusing, right? So, but I would say regardless of, I will answer the ownership piece, because the short answer is that it does change from project to project depending on our agreements with the site. However, I on any of the projects that we do, a core like principle for us that is non-negotiable is that the site that we're working with always needs to have full access to that data, to do, like, unrestricted, to do whatever they want. Right, so that the site can use it commercially if they want to. We don't want to make it available on Open Heritage for commercial access. We'd rather that go through the site itself. So that's something that's like a core piece that we've always had, is that, you know, any of the sites that we're working on, they get full access to all the data. On some of the projects, the sites themselves own the data, and that Cyark maybe gets a license to use it non-commercially and to show it like through our website. We need a license to the data in order to be able to show it. There have been very rare projects where we have done, you know, a capture that is like not able to be publicly available and we have no rights to it, but that's kind of an outlier. And then, you know, there are projects where we own the data and the site has like a full license to the data, is kind of the other model, or it's kind of like we both own the data. But, you know, because it's digital, it's not this like single thing. So there can be lots of different versions of it. But I think for us, that core piece is making sure that the site has full access to the data, gets a copy at the end of the project. If they ever write us, if they've lost it, they get it again. But there is, you know, flexibility, I think, around how to make these sites available, right? We want to be able to do things like we've done in that Resonant, that NEH grant, being able to go back to that same data set. Okay, what else can we do with it to tell new stories about these sites? And that's a big part of, you know, that having that access for us as well, and having that license to be able to kind of continue to explore it. I don't know if I've answered that. If there is more question, I'm happy to talk. We try to be as transparent as possible on that stuff. It's just that it does change site to site. And we've done a lot of work. You know, we're working a lot with Indigenous communities here in the US, but also internationally. And oftentimes the agreements are, we may have some ownership of the data, but cannot use it in a number of contexts, which are clearly outlined. And again, so that's just part of it. It becomes like a site to site thing.
No, that's great. I think it depends answer is super relevant, but the focus on that, it's a discussion with each individual site is really important, and that continued access. And so maybe as the very last question, because you hit on it a little bit, is the archival piece. The ability for sites to come back to Cyark and ask for copies of the data in the future. Do you want to talk about what that archival, the preservation aspect of the data?
Yeah, and this is, you know, it's a challenging one, right? The data is quite large. The formats have changed. I think we're in a pretty stable and have been for a number of years around it's all different kinds of data, but so I can break it down. So there's, you know, for us, we think about the LiDAR or the laser scanning data. And that is essentially just a bunch of individual data points. And so there is now, and I think it's been around probably for about 10 years at this point, but there's a interoperability format. So it's a non-proprietary format. It's this E57. So you can open it in, you know, open source software, you can open it in commercial software. So we make all those point clouds available as E57s, and it's a fairly stable format in terms of it being very, very human readable as well. You have a bunch of data points, right? You're not going to be able to see what it is, but so we put all of the LiDAR into that format. And then for the photogrammetry, that's just essentially images. So we store those original raw files on Open Heritage 3D just due to the size and, again, like reusability. We make the JPEG versions available just so that it's the most usable right away by people, and just because it's you know, hosting those large files is a challenge. We maintain that within our archive. And then, you know, when we have it, all of the data from our initial registration of those images is also included, the kind of camera poses, so you know where those photographs were taken. And and that kind of simple format actually works quite well. It means that people can download those data sets, they can bring them into whatever software they want. So you don't need proprietary software to do it. And you can still, get the information that you want. The viewer that I showed on Open Heritage is also, it's an open source viewer called Poetry. So we're using that to, again, showcase what data is even available before you download it. And when we think about archiving now, I mean, we still maintain, kind of our archive of the data, but we put a lot more emphasis on that reusability, because just putting the data away on a hard drive, even if it's replicated 100 times in the cloud and, offline on tape and all of that, really the best chance of these things surviving is through that reuse. And so we've put more emphasis on how do we make this accessible and reusable, in addition to, it's secure and all of that. But otherwise, if you just have, the equivalent of the dusty shelf that nobody sees, what value is that, right? And you don't know if it's even the right formats in some ways when it's changing constantly. But if we make it available for people to access today and they're reusing it, that data will continue to live on.
Great. Well, thanks, Liz.
Great. Thank you all so much. Yeah, feel free to get in touch. We're always happy to chat more and share more about the work. Thank you, Christine.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to everyone for your engagement the last couple of mornings. And this is just really kind of an informal closing, but wanting to wrap up this inaugural U.S. World Heritage Site Managers Forum. This idea grew out of what I saw after having been, especially serving overseas, that we just lack in the United States kind of a cohort of practitioners working together in support specifically of U.S. World Heritage Site Management. So I appreciated yesterday, starting with the traditional welcome from Taos Pueblo, Jonathan Putnam's session on periodic reporting, to working and talking specifically about climate change impacts to World Heritage Sites, living World Heritage Sites, and working with traditional cultural and traditional associated communities. Talking about heritage tourism this morning, and specifically World Heritage Tourism with Visit San Antonio. The cast of characters we're lucky to have here in San Antonio working under the umbrella of our U.S. World Heritage Site Management Plan, specifically for San Antonio missions. A special thank you to all of my colleagues here in San Antonio. We also heard, I thought, a very forward-looking discussion about philanthropy and opportunities for helping to promote and protect the U.S. World Heritage Site Management. Great presentations from both Chris Polglase on heritage impact assessments and the new guidance, and then Liz, really hitting some of those high points on access and equity when it comes to World Heritage Site documentation, and really thinking about, preserving that data for future use. So in wrapping up, a couple of the action items I wanted to share, especially for those who are on right now, who are World Heritage Site Managers. Things that are growing out of even the planning for this forum kind of going forward is an interest and continued connection between this cohort of U.S. World Heritage Site Managers and what that looks like, regular meetings, and some real strategic thinking about how to raise the visibility of U.S. World Heritage Sites in the United States, and really truly how we leverage that visibility to protect and promote U.S. World Heritage Sites. We're in the forever business, in the perpetuity business, and how we can kind of lock arms as a community of practitioners, but also the communities for whom on a very personal level, these places are home and have been significant in some instances since time immemorial. So how can we all work together to protect these places and raise their visibility? To include other action items, everything from perhaps making similar connections amongst the philanthropic organizations that are connected to each one of these U.S. World Heritage Sites, How can we link our strategic communications, whether it's via social media, on topics or issues that we share, to kind of amplify our audience, to continue to build the supporters, and really to continue to, we hope, inspire our next generation and the generations after that of U.S. World Heritage Site stewards and managers and leaders, and how we can tee them up to take some of our lessons learned, our best practices in the United States, to support the global U.S. World Heritage community, what that looks like, and how, as we address some issues that are common, whether it's working with traditionally associated communities as opportunities, issues and challenges such as climate change, how we can also look to the global World Heritage Site community where they may be working through similar issues, visitor capacity, et cetera, to exchange information and kind of lessons learned. I'll talk a little bit more about that during the session I have this afternoon. But with that, I know we've had a marathon of a morning with absolutely no break. I want to be sure that people have an opportunity to take a break and stretch before this afternoon's session of the U.S. ICOMOS Symposium. I'm looking forward to the keynote speaker, of course, National Park Service Director Sams, talking about Indigenous peoples and how Indigenous communities are integral to World Heritage Site management. So unless anyone has any questions, this will officially close the U.S. World Heritage Site Managers Forum. And I thank you so much for your participation, your engagement, and your passion for U.S. World Heritage Sites. Thank you.